everyone, and welcome Arundhati for this Women in Literature Festival session. First, a little bit about her as a way of introduction. Arundhathi Subramaniam is the award-winning author of 12 books of poetry and prose, widely translated and anthologized. Her most recent volume of books, Love Without a Story, has been described as a breathtaking and heartwarming book by Poetry Book Society Bulletin. Her previous book, When God is a Traveler, was the season choice of the Poetry Book Society, shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize. Arundhati is the recipient of various awards and fellowships, including the inaugural Pushpant Singh Prize, the Raza Award for Poetry, the Zee Women's Award for Literature, the Il Chepo Prize in Italy, the Zee Indian Women Award for Literature, the Mystic Kalinga Award, among others. She has written extensively on culture and spirituality and has worked over the years as poetry editor, cultural curator, and critic. She has been editor of the Indian domain of the Poetry International Web, a significant online archive of contemporary Indian poetry. As prose writer, her books include the best-selling biography of a contemporary mystic, Sadhguru, More Than a Life, and the Book of Buddha. As editor, her most recent book is the Penguin Anthology of Bhakti Poetry, Eating God. So, as we can see...
That's an exhaustive bio note. Thank you, Fatima. It's lovely to be here. And I just want to start by saying how happy I am. I think it's a very exciting, very thoughtful initiative that Sabine's put together. And to be in conversation with you, a fellow poet from the subcontinent, I think there's a sense of kinship already in place. Look forward to this.
Yes, it's been great meeting you over email and now finally seeing you and meeting you in your presence. It's great. So, my first question to you is that as we have just seen, you cover a phenomenal body of work. And as a writer, you have taken up many forms, quite like a goddess. And you've written both poetry and prose. You've also been a translator, a critic, and a journalist. Which role Arundhati is closest to you and why?
You know, the most honest answer is really, and perhaps the self-evident one, Fatima, is poetry. You know, poetry is what I've always wanted to do ever since I was a child. And I think later on, my life choices were just about building a sustainable existence around poetry. So the journalism, the curatorial work, all the other, you know, the poetry editorship, all of that happened essentially so that I could focus on what my primary love was, which was poetry. But I will say that all these other engagements and pursuits have nourished the poetry, and the poetry has nourished all of them. So it's very truly a symbiotic kind of relationship.
Yes, yes. Yeah. And as I said, it is like a goddess with many arms, and you're handling all of it. Previously, you have described your fascination with poetry the way dance excites me. It's unpredictable the way dance is. Could you tell us a little bit more about how poetry could be like dance?
You know, I often say this to remind myself, Fatima, because sometimes as I read a lot of poetry, I can get a bit jaded. And when I get jaded, I try to remind myself of what it was that turned me to poetry in the first place. And then I go back to my earliest recollections as a child, when I don't think any of us needed any training on why poetry is a wonderful thing. It just was an exuberant, immediate reaction to poetry. And I realized it's because poetry is language that is kinetic. It is language that dances. It is performative language. You know, the sense that I remember of seeing a dancer at one moment here on the stage and the next moment at the other, that leap is something verbally that poetry is capable of. So hence the image.
Okay. In Lovely Strangeness, you say that poetry transforms through contagion. It's at the beating heart of literature. How is it to be a contemporary woman poet? And are there any challenges to this station?
That's a big question. I'd say to be a contemporary poet today, globally, it's an exciting time to be a poet. It's a time of great challenge, a time of great transition, and hopefully some of that leaks into the work consciously and sometimes inadvertently. But it's an exciting time to be. It's an exciting moment in history. I'm glad we're around at this moment. About a woman poet, I'd say it's a more complex thing. If you would like, you know, since we are at a conference around women's literature, I'd say that, well, it is exciting. It is not without its very specific challenges as well. You know, we can talk more about those challenges if there's time. But yes, I'd say I'm not squeamish about the appellation woman poet. I think I'm fine with it. And I think it's not my only identity, but it's certainly an important one.
Okay. And what about feminism? What does feminism mean to you?
I'm grateful to feminism as a resource, as an archaeological implement, as a tool which has helped me critique or question the many ways in which gender is constructed. So I'd say that's how I responded to it many, many years ago as a young woman. And it's continued to have that significance in my life. The only thing I'd say is that I see myself very much as a work in progress. So I'm not, for me, the word feminism is important, and I would consider myself to be a feminist, but I see myself as a person on a journey of self-discovery on which feminism is a very important resource. So it's a journey and not a destination. I'm not a finished product.
Okay. Do you feel that women writers are subjected to any stereotypes? What would you say about that?
You know, in a sense, that comes back to what I was saying earlier about the specific challenges that women writers, I think, do encounter.
Yes.
And let me say this. You know, I don't want to dwell too much on it, but I will say this. It is absolutely true that there are nooks of entitlement, that there are all boys networks. Have I encountered them? Absolutely. Absolutely. And one has to encounter them and negotiate them and find a way around them, find a way under them. That is part of the whole negotiation. But I'd say I'd make a distinction between two or three kinds of gender-related irritants, if you will. The first is the most overt, which is browbeating. You know, it is bullying, straightforward bullying. So when my friend Kuti Revati, the Tamil poet, wrote a book called Breasts many years ago, in the early 2000s, it created an uproar in Tamil literary circles. She received obscene calls and letters, and you know, she was told by a bunch of male lyricists that women of this kind should be taken out and burnt on the streets. This is overt intimidation. This is a way of silencing, and it is still present in all kinds of ways. That's one kind. I may not have personally faced it, but it is there. And, you know, that's why I mention her, because she's a contemporary poet. When I come to another kind of gender-related peeve, I would say, I'd say it's something that every woman has encountered in the cultural sphere and in other spheres too, but we are talking literature here. And that is trivialization. You know, there are many ways to trivialize, to demean, to disparage, to marginalize. And I think we are all aware of that. And it has existed across cultures forever and ever. So I was reading W.H. Auden's preface to Adrienne Rich's first book just the other day, again. And he talks about poems that speak quietly but do not mumble, poems that respect their elders but are not cowed by them. They're neatly and modestly dressed. This is a kind of staggering paternalism that even some of our, you know, Auden is a poet I admire hugely, as I do Adrienne Rich, but this is the kind of thing that one has to negotiate. You know, he was doing it at a point in time, but I know that the British poet Vicky Fever, I remember her telling me once that she had a male critic who said, oh my God, on reading her book, said, oh my God, not another menstruation poem. You know, the implicit assumption being that what happens to half the planet really is of no relevance to the other half. You know, but if you wrote a war poem, would any of us say not another war poem? None of us would. So these are the kinds of I think, insidious forms of trivialization that are still very present and which one has to negotiate. The largest, and I will say this very briefly before we move on to your next question, I think something that many, many women artists grapple with is that if you deal with a theme that is considered to be the big theme, the theme of consequence, say war, you would be considered to be very often inauthentic. If you write about what is considered to be the small theme, you are seen as limited. So it's a double bind. If a male poet, I often say this, if a male poet writes about a mango tree in his backyard, it becomes a metaphor for the decline of civilization. It becomes a statement on metaphysical despair, on cultural aridity. But if a woman poet writes about the mango tree in her grandmother's backyard, it is narrow biography. It is navel gazing. So these are the kinds of different perspectives you have to constantly negotiate. But does that mean it's all gloomy? Absolutely not. I think there have been multiple women poets, many more coming out, and that's wonderful.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that answer. And there is a poem of yours, The Lover, and I will just quote a little bit from it. The woman doesn't call herself a saint, just a lover of a saint who's been dead 400 years. And I was thinking about it, is the spiritual a necessary part of the experience of poetry? And how has your own spiritual journey affected your writing?
I don't know if the spiritual is a necessary part, because that can sound prescriptive, and the whole point of poetry is to avoid any kind of prescription. I'd say for me, it has been an integral part. So I can't really separate my seeking from my poetry, because the two have gone together. And I'd say that it's not really how it has affected my writing is not in terms of what I'm writing about necessarily. If I looked at my earliest poems, I was writing about cities and friends and conversations and rages, and all the regular stuff that people write about, journey, quest, all of that is still what I'm writing about. So in terms of content or the what of my poetry, nothing has changed. But what has changed is the how. So how I approach a poem, how a poem of mine breathes on a page, the gaps in a poem, the holes, the perforations in a poem. I think that has entered my work. There's much more perforation in my poetry than ever before. And that's because I think any spiritual journey is about transforming who you are very fundamentally. So it will leak into your poetry in some way or the other.
For sure. You write in English. How does that feel? And what is your message to other English language poets from Asia or other parts of the world?
Well, I grew up in Bombay, which is also a city with many names. I often say it's a city that's called Bombay, Mumbai, Bombay, depending on what language you speak. And I love this multiculturalism and diversity of the city I grew up in. And I would say that, yes, it is an unfortunate historical circumstance that is responsible for all of us speaking English today. But that doesn't mean it is an aspect of our history that I feel obliged in some way to amputate. It has happened. It has now given rise, it was unfortunate, absolutely, but it has given rise to a very complex cultural legacy to which I am heir today. And I don't feel the need to sever one part of it and to sanitize it in order to be culturally innocent, because that kind of cultural innocence is not possible. We will only be faking it. So I'd rather celebrate the fact that, in fact, we have this multilingual inheritance. I'd celebrate it. I'd enjoy it. It allows me access to literatures from more than one language. I think it's an exciting place to be. Sometimes, Fatima, I feel the margins can actually be a good place because it allows you access to very deep canyons of cultural memory. And you have access to more than one. So I think that's where, that's where we are as subcontinentals in many ways. We have access to that richness.
Yes, we do. What would be your message to women poets?
I don't know if they need any messages, but the only thing I'd say, if I were to talk to myself as a young woman, today, if I were to look back and have a conversation with myself as a young woman, I would probably say self-doubt is all right, but don't corrode your insides with it. It's not worth it. Don't allow it to get toxic. It's not worth it. And I would also say all the naysayers around you, don't take them terribly seriously. What you need to take seriously is the fact that poetry is an art that involves rigor. It involves hard work. It involves asking yourself some difficult questions, but that is the pleasure of the process. I think eventually for many of us, at least socialized in a particular way, the naysayer is often your own voice. So that's the voice you need to tone down and to actually believe that this journey of discovery of what I call the shortest and most direct and most pleasurable verbal route to yourself, that journey is worth it. That's what poetry is.
Wow, that's very empowering. For me also, and for all the other women poets who will be listening to you. There is a poem of yours, a very short poem called Zoomsday, and it goes something like, a world full of windows, but no sign of a door. And in this short poem, there's that feeling of no exit, and yet there is the multiplicity of exchange and communication. And I was wondering how the pandemic has been for you as a poet.
Well, as you can see, that poem was written bang in the middle of the pandemic. And it was exactly what you're saying, this ambivalence. On the one hand, Zoom has made this very conversation possible, Fatima.
Yes.
You know, there you are in Pakistan and there's Sabine in Dubai, and we're able to have this conversation. It's fabulous. But so there is an intimacy, and I don't want to disparage that, which wouldn't have happened necessarily if I was, if this conference were to be held otherwise and you and I couldn't travel. But the adverse side of it, I think, has been the intense sense of just being isolated or secluded, sequestered in a way that has been unfortunate. I've not had to deal with the economic repercussions that so many have. But what I have had to deal with is the sense of not being able to turn a page in my head in the customary ways, which would have meant going out, meeting a friend, having a coffee, going to a bookshop. None of that is possible. We have to turn the page ourselves. And that's been challenging. And as I say in one of my poems that I wrote last year, I think the challenge of this time is the fact, and I say this in the poem, I say meaning won't save us, never has, but rhythms will. So it's been for me about trying to rediscover rhythms that will see me through this time.
Okay. So we have some time left, and I have one question, and then we can move to maybe a reading of one of your poems. So my last question is, what are some projects you are currently working on, and what is your inspiration behind them?
I'm glad you asked that question, because interestingly enough, one of the things I did work on during this pandemic is a long deferred book of essays. It's a book of actually recorded conversations with 4 women, contemporary women, walking the spiritual path today in their own absolutely individual, idiosyncratic ways. And what I found was common to all of them, though they're very different temperamentally, what I found was common is the sense of following this calling for whatever reason, a calling that is not fashionable, not glamorous. These are not women whom you're going to find on social media, not doing any of that, but following this quiet, invisible path with a certain doggedness and a kind of crazy one-pointedness that I found fascinating. So they're very diverse women. One is a naked woman mystic, another is a monk, a third is a woman who works with her access to inner sound. There are all kinds of women, but they are fascinating to me.
Yes, that does sound fascinating. So, Arundhathi, a few days before I fell into the chance of interviewing you, I was by chance reading a poem of yours titled When Landscape Becomes Woman. And there was such subtle beauty and delicacy of the realization that sometimes it takes us a lifetime to understand that our mothers are women, you know, as you say. And I've heard some other very powerful poetry readings of yours as well, but would you please read out this piece for us, or any other that you would like?
Actually, maybe this piece because you asked for it, but also because it's from my new book. So I'd be happy to read it for you.
Okay.
And it's actually addressed to all of us who at some point have seen our parents as just the landscape to our lives, you know, the backdrop to our lives.
Yes.
And then there suddenly comes a moment, at least in mine, when there was a jolt of recognition when I saw that this adult, you know, this person, this backdrop was actually a full-fledged human being.
Exactly. Yes.
Mm-hmm. When landscape becomes woman. And this is, let me dedicate this reading to you, Fatima, when landscape becomes woman. I was 8 when I looked through a keyhole and saw my mother in the drawing room in her hibiscus silk sari, her fingers slender around a glass of iced cola. And I grew suddenly shy for not having seen her before. I knew her well, of course. Serene undulation of blue malmal, wrist serrated by thin gold bangle, the gentle convexity of mole on upper right arm, and her high arched feet, better than I knew myself. And I knew her voice, like running water, ice cubes in cola. But through the keyhole at the grown-up party, she was no longer geography. She seemed to know just when to incline her neck, just when to sip her swirly drink, and she understood the language of lacquered nails and baritone voices and words like emergency. I could have watched her all night. And that's how I discovered that keyholes always reveal more than doorways, that a chink in the wall is all you need to tumble into a parallel universe, that mothers are women.
Mothers are women. Thank you so much, Arundhathi. And I guess we have time for one more question. Should I ask you just the last question?
Feel free, absolutely.
So in your poems, The City and I, Home and Madras, they're all about your relation to either home or a city. The following lines from Madras, for instance: mangy, bruised-eyed, non-vaccinated, suddenly mine. As opposed to, give me a home that isn't mine, where I can slip in and out of rooms without a trace. They both seem equally true. How do you explain that?
That's a tough one. Let me say that the word home was written at a time which actually seemed, when I look back, I feel it was actually a prescient poem because it seemed to prefigure certain directions in my life. I think what I'm curious about is how to be an engaged, how to be a visitor to a very familiar space. In a sense, Fatima, and as a fellow poet, you know this, that part of our whole project as poets is to defamiliarize the familiar. Yes. It is to make the mundane, recover the magical in the mundane. So in a sense, rediscovering the newness, the freshness, the aliveness of a jaded, familiar space. That's part of the journey of being a poet, I think. And equally, of course, I'm also a traveler. My life has been very nomadic. So I've also had to try and find my own sense of anchor in very diverse situations, in very diverse geographical contexts and cultural contexts. So I think that's been my riyaz in a way. That's been my sadhana, as we'd say in India. It's been good for me. It's been good penance and pleasurable. So the word penance is perhaps not right. It's been pleasurable practice at learning to be more human. So that's how the contradictions go together, I think. As I say at the end of that poem, and maybe we should conclude with the last lines of that poem, Home, it says, it starts by saying, give me a home that isn't mine. And it ends by saying, a home like this body, so alien when I try to belong, so hospitable when I decide, I'm just visiting.
That's lovely. That's lovely.
Thank you.
Arundhathi, thank you so much for being with us and for talking to me. I was so excited about meeting you and about actually seeing you, I mean, as in person as we can get through this medium. And it's been wonderful, really, to be in your presence. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fatima. All the best with your poetry.
Thank you so much.